On Remembrance Sunday, as we prayed, we remember those who've lost their lives in armed conflict and acts of terror. So it seemed appropriate to consider in our series on women in the Bible a grieving mother, Rizpah, or Rizpah. I'm probably going to say Rizpah as we go. In this fallen world, so many parents grieve their children prematurely, and with the bitter injustice of their lives not only having ended, but having been taken. Their condition, their grief, isn't alien to the human authors of Scripture. Sorrow is woven into the very thread of Christianity. So as we consider Rizpah tonight, I hope that we'll see better how God speaks his word to us, to all of us, and maybe learn to say, as Calvin did after losing his only child, after all, God is a father too. We're going to walk through this account, firstly considering what we do know, and secondly, what we can't know. Clarity and mystery. Well, firstly, let's look at what we know. Rizpah is mentioned nowhere else in the Bible outside the book of 2 Samuel. Back in chapter 3, it's verse 7 or 8, she's introduced as a concubine of Saul. You know, Saul as an eastern king, he's got multiple wives and he's got multiple concubines. And this concubine, Rizpah, seems to be a catalyst or the cause of the falling out between Abner, who I don't know if you remember the politics of the book of Samuel, but Abner was Saul's general, and Ishbosheth, who was Saul's son and his heir following the death of Saul and his son Jonathan. So Rizpah is the cause of the falling out between these two men, and Abner ends up siding with David, maybe you remember that, and then he gets murdered by Joab. Here in chapter 21, though, is the only other time that Rizpah is mentioned. In fact, if you search it, her name's mentioned once in chapter 3, and I think it's, 3 or 4 times here in chapter 21. And this story relates to the death of her 2 sons and her 5 nephews. And it's perhaps suggestive that because they get the 5 from somewhere else, that the 2 sons were her only sons, although we're not told. So let's understand how she comes to this terrible place. Well, these events take place sometime, we don't know quite when, during David's reign. That's what verse 1 tells us. It's probably after he's taken Mephibosheth into his house, but before Absalom's rebellion. That's quite a few years. There's been a 3-year famine in the land of Israel. And so David wisely seeks the face of the Lord to find out why. Although we might ask why it took him 3 years. But he understands from the law of Moses that famine is one of the punishments that Israel incurs for breaking their covenant with God. So when there's a famine, it's a suggestion, it's not a guarantee, but it's a suggestion that Israel has done something wrong according to the Sinai covenant. In this case, the answer is clear. It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death. If you look at verse 2, it fills in the details. I don't know if you remember the Gibeonites. They came under Israel's covenantal protection back in Joshua chapter 9, where all Israel promised to protect them. They were a Canaanite, or sometimes called an Amorite people group, as it is here. And they became, I don't know if you remember the story, they became servants to the Israelites in the land after deceiving Joshua and Israel to make a covenant with them. And, you know, they sort of bring all this mouldy bread and they've got worn out shoes and say, oh no, we've come away from a far out land, make a covenant with us. And Israel does. And then it turns out they live just there a little bit north of Jerusalem. So though Israel promised to protect them, Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, had tried to annihilate them. And that gives us a suggestion that he didn't just, kill a few. This was a full-blown pogrom. This was hunting them out, trying to find every last one of them and wipe them out from the land. In a way, this is exactly the kind of behavior that we expect from Saul at this point, isn't it? Even after losing God's favor, he would do big acts that, at least on the surface, look like they're motivated by covenant faithfulness, by a desire to bless God, but they seem to have other motives under the surface, and his own pride and just the wild swings in mood and action that Saul displays are under the surface. Well, here he's possessed by a kind of nationalistic fervour where he decided to try to eradicate this non-Israelite people group living in the heart of the nation, in fact living predominantly in his own tribal allotment of Benjamin. If you look on the map and see where Gibeon is, that's where it is. It's in the portion of Benjamin. But Israel as a nation had sworn, they'd made a covenant to protect the Israelites. Again, do you remember that battle? It's a great Sunday school story, isn't it? Where the sun stands still in the sky. That was Israel fighting to keep their covenant with Gibeon against 5 kings of the Amorites. I think it's the king of Jerusalem and 4 other kings. They sort of get an army together to go and take out the Gibeonites because they know, they're siding with Israel, they're dangerous, they're traitors, let's get rid of them. And so Israel goes in to protect them, and God keeps the sun in the sky so that he can gain the victory on behalf of the Gibeonites. So when Saul foolishly broke that covenant, he broke his promise, he broke the oath of Israel. By persecuting the Gibeonites, he brought judgment on all Israel. That famine was a messenger from God calling on the nation to sort themselves out, to cleanse themselves of the guilt that Saul, as their representative, had brought on all of them. Now, I just need to explain this a little bit. The Bible, as we always say, teaches individual responsibility for sin. We die for our own sins, not for what other people have done. Ezekiel chapter 18, it's a great chapter to teach that. But the Bible also teaches that where God deals with nations as corporate entities, as he does with Israel, blessing the righteous and the unrighteous alike, he says, I'm going to be faithful to you as a nation. And people within the nation who aren't faithful will benefit from that. Where he deals with nations like that, there's a corporate responsibility and a corporate punishment for the sins of the nation. That's what's happening here. Israel's king had sinned. I'm sure that plenty of the other people who engaged in this violence against the Gibeonites, they would be punished, but so were plenty of other people who had nothing to do with it. And the whole nation, you see, suffers the consequences for what a individual or a small group of people has done. And whether you think that's fair or not, it is tied up with God's covenant to the nation of Israel. They are blessed as a nation, but they are judged as a nation as well. It's part of the package. Let's get back to the story. David now wants to set things right. He knows this has been wrong. Saul shouldn't have treated the Gibeonites this way. He shouldn't have broken Israel's covenant with them. So he wants to make it right. And so in verses 2 and 3, he asks the Gibeonites what recompense they feel is just. And we'll stop here for a second again. Because in some ways, I think that seems like a fair course of action, doesn't it? The Gibeonites have been grievously, I don't even know if we've got a word bad enough to show how badly wronged they've been. And a curse has been brought on all Israel. So you think satisfying the Gibeonites ought to satisfy God. That's logical, isn't it? If your child smashed the windscreen of someone's car, I hope you'd go to the owner of the car, you'd apologise, and you'd ask them how much they needed to repair it. You'd offer recompense, wouldn't you? You know, what do you need? How much? What do I need to do to make this right? But we should know, as students of the Bible, the biblical connections that the Gibeonites come with. If you remember the story, I mentioned it before, they only came under Israel's protection because Israel didn't ask God what to do. At the beginning, David rightly consulted God to find out what the problem was. But instead of consulting God and asking what the solution should be, he asks the wronged party. And I don't know that we should be too harsh on the Gibeonites, because I don't know that any of us would have asked for anything better. In fact, they seem quite measured in their response in some ways. But David's oversight in not consulting the Lord has to frame the rest of everything that happens. Because given this offer, after a little appropriate and suitably humble beating around the bush, where the Gibeonites say, we have no right, yada, yada. The Gibeonites say, they get to the heart of the matter, what they want is to put to death and expose the bodies of 7 male descendants of the house of Saul. Saul's dead, they can't get their hands on him, but there are people still alive from his household. That number 7, it suggests a completeness. It's symbolic of the house that has wronged them being completely wiped out as a political force. Even though David spares Mephibosheth, that's mentioned in the text, and we've no reason to assume that there aren't other male descendants of Saul alive. I think Shimei is one who survives into the reign of Solomon before he is put to death. And there could have been others. If you've got that many wives and concubines, you're probably going to have more than 7 sons, aren't you? Well, David hands over the requested men, and the Gibeonites carry out their executions. No one knows, there's no agreement in the commentators over what form this would have taken, whether it was a kind of impaling, something a bit like a crucifixion, whether it was a public hanging or some other execution. But the bodies were left out on display, exposed to the elements. That's what it means by exposed. It's not necessarily talking about nudity, it's talking about just leaving them out there visible. They were denied a proper burial. Again, if we're students of the Bible, we should know that this is a sign of shame and curse. Cursed is the one who is hanged on a tree. Proper burial was vital in the worldview of ancient Near Eastern peoples, and that includes the Hebrews. By displaying the bodies in this way, the Gibeonites are deliberately desecrating the bodies. That's what's happening here. It is the ultimate insult, the ultimate vengeance. As far as they're concerned, they're not just killing the bodies, but they're denying these men a proper afterlife. What greater way to get their vengeance? What greater wound could they do to the house of Saul? Not just removing some of its members, but removing them from the face of existence, as it were. And this is where Rizpah properly enters the story. She makes, as we read, a sort of tent next to the bodies of her sons and nephews. That's probably what the sackcloth means. Sackcloth's associated with mourning. You put on sackcloth to mourn, but she's making a kind of shelter here. And from April, that's when the first barley harvest was, until the rains, that's usually between October and December, although it could have been before that. And for that period of time, she guards the bodies. She stopped the carrion birds when they came looking for easy prey. Crows, vultures, buzzards. She stopped the wild animals from eating the corpses. And bear in mind that wild animals includes lions as well as packs of wild dogs. This isn't just driving off a few rats and foxes. For possibly months, Rizpah sat outside watching her boys rot and decay. Her life and future was disintegrating in front of her eyes. And as one commentator says, the horror defies description, and the narrator does not describe it either. Rizpah, in a little tent, she doesn't interfere with the bodies. That would have been defying the king's command. However much, she wants to do what any mother would and do the least, to give them at least a proper burial. But she doesn't defy the king. But at unimaginable personal cost, she stops anyone or anything else interfering with them either. She does all that is in her power to do. And when David hears about what she's doing, he has those bodies, along with the remains of Saul and Jonathan, gathered together and given a proper burial. And once all these bones have been laid to rest, that is when God relents and the famine ends. Let's just try and think these things through. Back in Joshua, the Gibeonites were told that they were cursed because of their deception. Now that, in the Bible, that isn't just a sort of a bad word. It's often more technical. There are consequences attached to a curse. When God cursed the ground in Genesis 3, it isn't just, oh, what a shame. There are consequences to that. There are real world consequences. A curse is a real thing in the Bible. And here we see that curse playing out so tragically. Because of his own disobedience, Saul was rejected as king. You can read about that in 1 Samuel 15. It says in verse 28 of that chapter, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbours." That means that his dynasty is going to end. It's not just, well, you're not going to be king anymore, but maybe one of your sons. It's, you're not going to be king, and neither is any one of your family. You are a spent force. We see that unfolding here, even through the cruel vengeance of the Gibeonites. Through the sin of men, sinful men's chickens come home to roost. But for all these questionable decisions that leave such a sour taste in our mouths, King David is presented here, as opposed to Saul, as the chosen one of God, mediating on behalf of the land. He even, as we read, shows mercy to the house of Saul in preserving Mephibosheth. And then it's at his orders that the bodies are given a proper burial. Unlike Saul, you see, David is an oath-keeping king. Do you notice how it reminds us that he'd made an oath to try and, after the death of his friend Jonathan, he says, "Is there no one of the house of Saul that I can bless? Because I love Jonathan so much, I want to do something for him, and I can't because he's dead. But is there someone associated with him that I can love, that I can welcome into my home, that I can raise up?" And it's Mephibosheth who benefits from that. David is an oath-keeping king. But what should be clear to us is the essential role that Rizpah, a grieving mother, played in bringing an end to this famine. Without her courage, without her faithfulness to her family and to the land of Israel, without her peaceful protest, without subjecting herself to horror, danger, and grief that we can't even begin to imagine, and part of me doesn't even want to try, without that, David wouldn't have buried the men that the Gibeonites killed, and God would not have answered the prayers of his people. The clarity we have here, what we know, is of a faithful God working through a faithful woman in the middle of a broken world. But now let's think about what we can't know. Because obscurity, ambiguity, and downright perplexity seems to follow Rizpah around. Now, when she's introduced in chapter 3, we don't actually know whether Abner, who was, we're told in that passage, he was strengthening his political position. We don't know whether he had truly slept with Rizpah. That would have been a bid to claim authority, you see, over the house of Saul by taking one of Saul's women. We don't know if he'd done that, if it was just a product of Ishbosheth's paranoia, and we're not told. And in this account, there's so much deliberate ambiguity, frankly, it's frustrating. And as with so many other Bible stories, we are never told what's going through Rizpah's head. In fact, we're not told the thoughts or feelings of anyone in the story. I mean, cast your eyes over it. It doesn't describe a single inner state to us. Only what they said and what they did. And we do wonder, don't we? Is this a story that condones the practice of human sacrifice? Because that's exactly what the Gibeonites seem to do, and it isn't condemned. David doesn't say, no, I'm not doing that. Would be terrible. That's shocking. What an awful thing to suggest. He says, okay. They tell David they'll expose these men before the Lord, as if these 7 men are a guilt offering to cleanse Saul's blood guilt. It's exactly what they do in verse 9. And David seems to be approving of it. It raises questions that we don't have the answers to. Although I've said before, it's not when they are killed that the famine ends. It's when Rizpah's grief causes David to give all of the dead of the house of Saul a proper burial. But there's an absence of value judgments throughout. What I mean is, we don't know if God approves of these killings or not. It just doesn't say, does it? God tells David what the root cause of the famine is. And then he's silent for the rest of the chapter. Is that a tacit approval? Is it a tacit condemnation? Though I was kind of singing his praises before, is David a hero here for being part of ending God's judgment on the land? Or is he the same flawed king who will order a census of the fighting men in chapter 24 and so bring God's judgment on the land? And if you read these two chapters together, chapter 21 and chapter 24, there are linguistic echoes in them. We're supposed to read them as they're like bookends. These mysteries, these tensions, I think they might indeed get right to the heart of why God puts stories like this into his holy and inspired word. Because in life, maybe it's just me, maybe I think it's everyone, we want simple, straightforward answers, don't we? We want clarity and happy ever afters. And our world tells us that we should be happy all the time. You know, you are to ditch toxic friends and family who don't affirm you all the time. You know, if you're not 100% fulfilled in your job, quit. Everyone can be a Disney princess. Everything is awesome. But so often, simple answers make simple people. Shallow answers make shallow people. Complex wrestling with mystery through our tears makes people with their fingers on the pulse of life. Because life in a fallen world, and I've said it in this series many times, is complex, it is dark, and it is messy. We know, don't we? Some psalms end, praise be to the Lord forever, amen and amen. And others end, you have taken me from my friend and neighbour. Darkness is my closest friend. God came into this world in the person of Jesus Christ to love and serve broken, hurting, grieving people. And that meant being broken. It meant suffering hurt. It meant grieving over the death of his father Joseph and weeping at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. I'm reminded of the benediction I'm going to read at the end of the service. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. Jesus sends us to love and serve broken, hurting, grieving people, and to grow in our usefulness for that task. God grows us through brokenness, hurt, and grief. We should be very careful of rushing too quickly or too simply past Rizpah and the darkness of her situation. We might want to run on into something more encouraging, and I was trying to think, what's the application of this? Do I just say, be faithful, or is it an emphasis on peaceful protest, the power of peaceful protest against unjust authority, or whatever simple solution I could have tried to come up with? But maybe sometimes all we can do is to sit down with Rizpah and weep. Our world wants to silence the sound of any minor key in our lives, to distract us from our grief with bright lights and endless popcorn nothings. I think, it was Tuesday night, was it, the Bake Off final? I wonder how many millions watched that. Wasn't it lovely? I'm sure I didn't watch it. We had to end a planning meeting short because people wanted to watch Bake Off. I'm not knocking Bake Off, but isn't that what the world's like? It's just like, isn't it nice? Everything's just quite pleasant. Millions of people have watched that. How many people have read this story in the Bible? This story is horrendous, but isn't it true to the human condition? Doesn't it make us think? Doesn't it make us ask questions of God? Let me ask, will you learn more of the crucified Christ through hearing the parable of the prodigal son for the umpteenth time? Or through seeing the world for a moment through the eyes of a woman like Rizpah? Again, I've quoted this before. The American poet Robert Browning Hamilton wrote this verse. I walked a mile with pleasure. She chatted all the way, but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word said she. But oh, the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me. Jesus is the chosen one of God, the true chosen one. He's not like Saul, and he's better than David. He's the only one. Because however wise David is in this story, he can't fix things like Jesus can. Jesus is the only one who can bring purpose and hope to a desolation like that faced by noble Rizpah. He's the only one that can steal the grave's victory and offer true gospel, resurrection hope to grieving parents and to grieving children, to grieving spouses and grieving hearts. Whatever you are going through, I direct you to him, the crucified one, the one exposed on a tree, the one who rose, the one who brings life to all who trust in him. But will we learn from passages like this to walk a mile with sorrow? To embrace both clarity and mystery, and grow into truly deep people who are of use to the grieving, broken, hurting hearts of this world. Let's sing our final hymn, number 418. I could think of no better.